Hello there friends and welcome. Today we have a return to Warhammer 40K Rogue Trader, as we just got the biggest patch yet, with loads and loads of changes. Patch 1.2. It has over 2,500 changes, 30% larger than the previous big update 1.1. The biggest changes of this patch are major balance updates, so expect a lot of nerfs, especially to Officer, but also Cassia as a Navigator. On the other hand, despite all the nerfs, we do have a few buffs as well, especially to Psykers, so the Sanctioned Psykers as in the main character, and even Pyromancers. I'll of course focus on the mechanic gameplay changes, but there's a lot of other quality of life, stuff improvements, bug fixes and so on. Even new visual effects and animations, so let's just get right into it. Because of how extensive the mechanics changes are, all party members will get a free respec, which is fun. So let's start with the mechanics, first with the Pyromancy buff. Their main damage dealing skill, so their starter Ignite spell, has been buffed. The minimal damage is now 1 plus willpower bonus plus 6 times Psi rating. As for the maximum damage, 2 times willpower plus 10 times Psi rating. So that's even more than double the maximum amount it had before. Because a lot of other Pyromancer skills are directly tied to your Ignite damage like Firestorm, Incinerate and Molten Beam, they now also have way higher damage. This is a very welcome addition because, I'll be blunt, the first time I played Rogue Trader, it was in the beta, I started as a Pyromancer and I was absolutely horrified at how bad the damage was. I'm not even kidding. You could deal 1 damage, because that was the minimum, right? Before it was 1 plus 5 times Psi rating, except you started with 0 Psi rating as a Sanctioned Psyker. So the minimum damage was just that, 1. After all, 5 times 0 is 0, so that's what you got. Which is what made me just run away from the subclass as soon as possible and go into the Santic Psyker, because at least you could buff your allies. Praise the Emperor because now this has been changed, so I really feel like actually doing a Pyromancy build now, focused on blasting. The Pyromancer's staff's damage has also been buffed, and you have a few other pyro buffs, such as extra warp burn damage, and even higher melting armor debuff potential. And I might as well cover this now, but the prerequisites for the Psi rating boosting talents, which have been renamed now, instead of 1 to 4, they are Minoris, Major, Extremis, and Terminus. Well, the requirements have been highly reduced for Sanctioned Psykers, right? 6 less levels. Which does mean the main character, who can only be a Sanctioned Psyker, can now increase their Psi rating earlier. And of course this does matter because, as we just saw from the Ignite damage formula, almost all of your psychic powers, no matter the subclass, are directly tied to your Psi rating, and before you could only start with 0 as a Sanctioned Psyker, so you had a very disappointing early game. Now at least this has been changed for a much smoother game progression. And dear Idira, the unsanctioned Psyker party member, won't be the Psyker goddess of the game anymore, because at least you can compete now as a Sanctioned Psyker yourself. These are the most important buffs. But now we do have to cover all of the heavy nerfs, I'm afraid, and there's a lot of them, especially for officers and dear Cassia, the Navigator party member. Starting with a nerf to one of the most powerful talents in the game, Seize the Initiative. It no longer provides an additional turn to the officer. Instead, the officer and allies under the effect of the officer's voice of command will deal additional damage to enemies that have not yet acted in combat. This is the only nerf that I find rather disappointing, although I do understand the reasoning behind it. The main issue is initiative in Warhammer 40K Rogue Trader is very much random. Unlike in other games such as Pathfinder or Baldur's Gate 3, where you can stack your initiative to high enough scores through gear, buffs, and feats, to the point where you'll almost always act first before the enemy, which of course is very powerful in a turn-based game. This simply does not exist in Rogue Trader. You don't have improved initiative, mythic initiative, the alert feat, there's nothing. It's mostly your agility and perception scores, and that's it. I don't think you even have a talent that increases initiative. When combined with the fact you're almost always fighting 10 plus enemies, chances are some, if not most of them even, will act before your characters, which is of course very annoying. But I suppose it means at the very least your tanks like Abelard are even more useful now. Anyways, perhaps I'm being a tad dramatic, but there's still a saving grace. At the very least, past Act 1, so the early game, by going Grand Strategist, which has always been one of the best prestige classes anyways, you are still guaranteed acting first, which is a tremendous boosting power. So there's still some hope. It's just that it won't happen very early in the game. Anyways, the second is a nerf to the Master Tactician archetype. It now provides a +5 fellowship bonus when an ally uses a heroic act, and a +5 toughness when using desperate measures, instead of providing an additional turn. As you can see, the main focus of this patch is, well, basically destroying the whole extra turn stacking strategy. I can understand why, because it could go into crazy amounts to the point where you would have so many extra turns, the enemies wouldn't get even a single turn, all at the start of battle for absurdly broken alpha strikes. These are the main officer nerfs, as they were also quite good when combined with Master Tactician. Now we have a lot of Cassia nerfs. Our Navigator companion, also the strongest story party member. Her Reveal the Light power will now increase toughness and willpower by a lesser amount. 10 plus 2 times willpower bonus instead of 4 times willpower bonus. I think it's kind of funny that it says navigators can no longer use Reveal the Light on themselves, but it's not like you can get navigator powers, it's only Cassia, as far as I'm aware anyways. But she can no longer buff herself with Reveal the Light, which of course matters because Reveal the Light itself scales based on willpower. And if Cassia buffed herself with it before, she could then buff your remaining allies with a stronger effect, by virtue of her own willpower being increased. Second, her Blood Augury talent will now increase warp damage by 5 plus perception bonus percentage instead of 2 times perception bonus percentage. Also a nerf because it's not being multiplied anymore, and perception is very easy to increase with Cassia as she does have specific buffs for that. And it can now stack up to 5 times. Meanwhile, her Eye of Oblivion talent will now reduce enemy dodge and hit chance, also by a lesser amount. Equal to perception bonus instead of twice that, so it was way better before. Kinda sad because it was one of the main easiest ways of reducing all of the enemies' attack and dodge, especially for unfair early on. Her Undam the Sea of Souls power will now reduce enemy armor by a smaller amount as well, 5 plus Navigator willpower bonus instead of 2 times willpower bonus. Meanwhile, her Mastery of Time talent can now stack up to 5 times, and only from extra turns gained by your allies. This is understandable because before, it used to just stack to infinite amounts, and it was rather silly because even at the very beginning of the game, your Cassia could already have higher than 200 willpower. It was hilarious, especially when combined with the Marine Officer background, because it does have a unique ability that grants extra turns to all allies. You could only use them to move, but it didn't matter. The whole point was abusing that to increase Cassia's willpower by enormous amounts. And as you can see from the other nerfs, almost everything good for Cassia scales directly based on her willpower. So the less her willpower, well, the less her combat potential. Even her hit points can scale from it. So that's it for all the Cassia nerfs, also the officer nerfs, and the PYRO buffs. But we have a few other changes. Now it's a nerf to the assassin archetype. Killing Edge now deals additional damage, which is not modified by any other damage modifiers. And the extra damage was changed to lethality divided by 7 instead of by 5. I suppose it's also understandable because Killing Edge was one of the easiest ways of achieving absurdly broken damage. But assassins are still great, I suppose. We also have some operative buffs. Several of their abilities were rebalanced to give more impactful bonuses at the start of the game, but lower their mid and late game scaling. Understandable, I'm all about stuff that increases your power in the early game, which is always the most annoying part of any cRPG, as you aren't really that powerful yet, especially on higher difficulty modes. This is the same for Pasqal background talents, as they also had their scaling changed to give better bonuses at the start. Now we have changes to the Arch-Militant class, one of the strongest archetypes before. For pretty much anything tanking damage, you could stack a lot of bonuses on it. They were also changed to give better bonuses at the start of combat at the cost of reducing their scaling from a number of versatility stacks, which could be stacked to enormous amounts before. We also have changes to some of their abilities, like Wildfire no longer giving a stack, with no regard for the type of the previous attack. This was one of the easiest ways to already start with a big versatility stack. And the minimal cost of Wildfire is 1, also a big nerf because you could easily reduce it to 0 before, for essentially a free attack. Reckless Rush now always gives 3 stacks of versatility, also a nerf. When you combine with Wildfire and other stuff, you could get very high stacks very fast. Also, when their heavy weapon attack cost is reduced, it has a minimum cost of 1. It's kinda the same as Wildfire, because, once again, if you reduce it to 0, you could have a free attack. Well, besides all the sad nerfs, we do have new talents as well. Warriors have Scissoring Strike. When they use Slash with 2 melee weapons, they'll deal damage from both weapons. This is for dual wielding, of course. Plus Easy Target. Their critical damage will be increased by their strength bonus against enemies not armed with a melee weapon. Most enemies in the game actually have guns, and they are tougher than the melee enemies. For a common talent we have Weapon Specialist. The sweep attacks of axes and the shove attack of maces cost 1 less action point. This is great. The less action points you are spending, the better, always. So you can do more stuff in the same turn, of course. Plus, also another talent to boost dual wielding, Dual Weapon Specialist. Using the sweep attack of the axes and shove of the maces and hammers will not increase the AP cost or reduce the weapon skill or ballistic skill of another weapon. We already covered the main PSYKER buff here, and at the very least we do have a buff to Arch-Militant Psykers, because their abilities have bigger synergy with psychic powers now, as they will count as attacks of the appropriate type for the purposes of versatility stacks. Each different PSYKER spell will count as something different, so single target, ranged area attacks, or even burst from the PYROMANCER Inferno. These are definitely the most important changes. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff here that I think is better covered when I actually do the builds, the upgraded ones anyways for the companions, and also whatever new content they add in the DLC. Which is also part of the reason why I have not released new builds for Rogue Trader, as I know the DLC is just about to hit. Next month, I believe. So I might as well wait until then, so I can combine both the patch and also the DLC changes for truly up-to-date content. But if you know of an important change I didn't cover, feel free to comment down below. Well, alright friends, so this was it for our Rogue Trader Patch 1.2 guide. If you found it useful, as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member if you can. I highly appreciate your support. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, friends.